Hello everybody, wherever you are in the world, thank you for joining us. I'm Richard Jones, Head of Policy and Regulatory Engagement at IOSH, and I'd like to welcome you to the 9th in our series of IOSH Covid-19 webinars. Today's covers the very important topic of returning safely after lockdown and employers' obligations. These obligations and their delivery, of course, really matter and can be mandatory or voluntary and affect millions of workers, their families and their communities worldwide. As always, today's session aims to share knowledge and experience. So as well as my introduction, we'll have presentations from 4 leaders in their fields and then close with a brief discussion rather than traditional Q&A. I'll now quickly run through some housekeeping points before we begin. All attendees are muted. On your screen, you'll notice a small bar with chat and Q&A options. If you have any technical or audio problems, please use the chat option so a member of the IOSH team can help. And if you have any questions for the presenters on the session, please post them using the Q&A option. Now, though we won't be answering questions today, there isn't time, we'll forward them to relevant speakers and we'll use the answers to inform a frequently asked questions section that will appear on our website. And finally, this session is being recorded for future playback and sharing. Now, for those who don't know much about IOSH, we are multifaceted. We're a chartered professional body, a charity, and internationally recognized NGO. We support over 48,000 members in more than 130 countries. Our members work at strategic and operational levels in all sectors and sizes of organisation, enabling them to safely provide the world's vital goods and services despite the difficult circumstances. Our work is informed by our thought leadership activities, including policy, research, guidance, and of course training. And this includes, of course, the COVID series of webinars, which brings experts together to discuss best practice in managing this crisis. Now, more than ever, organisations need useful guidance on managing the safety and health of their workforces. So please visit the IOSH website for our regularly updated COVID-19 resources at iosh.com/coronavirus. So what do employers need to consider as workplaces across the world reopen their doors? Today's webinar looks at the health and safety obligations of organisations with an estimated 3 billion workers affected by lockdown worldwide. As the pandemic runs its course and as the infection transmission rate, or the R rate as it's often referred to, is brought under control, more and more countries are cautiously easing their restrictions, and more employers are wanting to know what their obligations are and what they need to do to protect their workers during transition. Our distinguished panel of speakers will outline some of the key principles underpinning employer obligations, mindful, of course, that they have duties under various laws, as well as national and local COVID requirements, and that their obligations can go beyond legal ones when they choose to adopt best practice. As we all know, essential services have continued operating throughout this crisis, and forward-thinking employers have already been planning for safely restarting work, once allowed to do so, of course. It's not just about opening workplaces and expecting workers to return. It must be safe and healthy and create a new normal that works for everyone. Now, IOSH stresses that health and safety must come first when restarting work, protecting workforces and communities and boosting engagement and productivity. We promote a beyond compliance focus using a systematic plan, do, check, act approach. With well-planned and risk-controlled operations that ensure safe people, safe workplaces, safe systems, and safe equipment. We believe this should be based on strong leadership, worker involvement and sound health and safety advice, with cross-functional teams assessing the risk for both COVID and also general health and safety, ensuring action before workers return. As mentioned, organisations need to adhere to national COVID policies, including for safe travel, and they must conduct inspection and assessment of all relevant areas to check there's been no deterioration during lockdown. So, looking at a few examples of where OSH professionals can help organisations. So, for people, employers need to assess COVID-related risk and protect all workers, including the vulnerable. And this includes providing adequate training, consultation, communication, and equipment, together with mechanisms for workers to raise concerns. For workplaces, they need to provide physical distancing, working from home wherever possible, but in the workplace, the provision of signage, distance marking, barriers, one-way systems, staggered work times, reduced staff on site, etc. And of course, improved hygiene, such as washing facilities, hand sanitizer, regular surface cleaning, and so on, together with enhanced ventilation arrangements. While for their systems, employers need to review all risk assessments in the light of COVID requirements, and that they have effective arrangements for fire safety, first aid, water and asbestos management, and emergencies. They need to ensure workers with symptoms know that they shouldn't be at work, and offer ongoing mental health support and flexibility for work-life balance issues. And of course, for equipment, they need to provide the necessary personal protective equipment and safe use guidance. They need to check their heating, ventilation, lighting and hygiene facilities, and they must ensure safe recommissioning of plant and equipment and statutory inspections. Overall, organisations need to stay updated, monitor performance and check that everything's working well, strengthening it where it's needed. So after that brief opening, I'd like to introduce our esteemed panel, who will cover the topics in more detail from their individual perspectives. And I'm delighted that we have on the line today, first, Gabriella Troncoso, an expert support service manager at Enhesa, based in Brussels. She works with international companies on the rollout and implementation of environmental health and safety global compliance programs. As part of her role, she's carried out on-site projects in France, Denmark, Netherlands, and Germany. She's a qualified lawyer based in Mexico, and she also holds a master's degree in globalization and law from Maastricht University. Then we'll have Malcolm Staves, Corporate Health and Safety Director at L'Oréal, the cosmetics giant. Malc joined L'Oréal in 2008 and is responsible for the development of the group's health and safety and fire prevention strategies, objectives and plans. Since his arrival within L'Oréal, Malc has developed strategies for the globalization of health and safety with a focus on risk management, visible leadership and safety culture. His next challenges relate to spreading the safety culture beyond the gates of L'Oréal. Next, we have David Green, who is Vice President of the Law Society. David is a senior partner with Edwin Coe and is a litigator and claimants practitioner focusing on commercial claims. He's head of the Litigation and Dispute Resolution Group and the Group Action Litigation Department. David is also chair of the Policy and Regulatory Affairs Committee and the International Committee. He has authored and contributed to various books on civil justice and is consultant editor with the New Law Journal. We will then be hearing from Mary Lawrence, a partner at international law firm Osborne Clarke. And she leads the health and safety team, which advises clients on compliance with health and safety law, providing representation following investigations by the Health and Safety Executive or other authorities in the UK. On COVID-19, Mary advises on what businesses are permitted to do under coronavirus regulations and both government and World Health Organization's guidance, and supports businesses to go back into the workplace while managing coronavirus risks. A fantastic panel, I'm sure you'll agree. So if we move into the presentations, I'd like to welcome Gabriella. If you could unmute and share your slides, please, Gabriella.
So thank you very much. So today I'm going to talk about the preventive measures to come back to the workplace, and give a little bit of the nuances, point out the nuances around the globe. So here's our agenda for today. I will give a brief introduction, then I will talk about the common measures and the nuances on those preventive measures to come back to work. And then I will touch upon briefly about mental health. And finally, I will give some recommendations. So Enhesa is a global company that helps multinational companies with their EHS obligations. How do we help them? Well, we provide them with the regulatory information. Enhesa covers more than 300 jurisdictions, and we cover, our content is available in English and also in local language. Okay. Then this is a very simplistic timeline of COVID-19, but I just included because I thought it was good to give a bit of to give a little bit of context. So by the end of 2019, there was a new virus identified in China. Then in February this year, we started to see the increase in the number of cases in the north of Italy, and some of the EU member states started reporting cases. Then in March, the World Health Organization said that this situation could be characterized as a pandemic. And from February all the way through April, we started seeing that the governments issued stay-at-home orders and stopped the operations of certain companies. And then as of mid-May, we started seeing the lifting of stay-at-home orders. That's the case of Belgium, where, for example, working from home is no longer mandatory where possible. Okay, so with this lifting of stay-at-home orders, we see, for example, in Germany that even all the shops, regardless of their size, are open now, provided that the people use face masks and also that the safe distance among the people is ensured. And we also see that, for example, in Estonia, they allow now the cross-border of those employees that have to go to Estonia to work from Finland or from Lithuania and Latvia. So with all this coming back to work, the return back to normal operations, employers have to prepare or have in place plan to return safe to work. That is one of the common measures that we see. And also it's one of the, I would say, the overarching of the new ones. And we have some jurisdictions as an example here. That is the case of China, Colombia, India, South Africa, Australia, and the US, where this is required. And these plans include a number of measures that are included in this presentation. And for these plans, sometimes they have to be available not only to the employees, but also to the community as a whole. You can give them to your employees via online, and also provide a hard copy. And this is the case of the state of Michigan in the US, where those companies that are allowed to resume operations, in-person operations, they have to have these plans by 1st June or within 2 weeks of resuming in-person activities. Then, with this plan, they also have to include how to respond in case there is a COVID-19 positive case among their employees. And we also see certain differences. For example, in India, if you have 1 or 2 cases, then you just close a certain area of the office where that person was during the last 48 hours. And you clean and disinfect. Whereas if you have a larger outbreak, then you would have to close the whole building and close it for 48 hours after cleaning and disinfecting. we see that in Colombia, it is just to dress like you have to close the area where the person infected was, clean and disinfect, and no other indication. So important for this plan to return safe to work is that there has to be a appointed person to oversee the implementation. And in the case of South Africa, the name is the COVID-19 compliance officer. They have to designate a person, but in other countries we see the same, that there has to be a person assigned to oversee the implementation of that plan. Another of the measures is that the return to work has to be in phases. So the employers will have to reorganize or create work shifts. So not all of the people returns at the same time. Also, they have to ensure that the employees take their lunch breaks in staggered. Okay, so they are not all together in the same place. Then the social distancing, this is by far one of the most common ones as well. And but the difference here is that it's not the same, the social distancing in Colombia than in India. For example, in Colombia and Portugal, it's 2 meters, whereas in India, Singapore, and Mauritius is 1 meter. For South Australia, the state of South Australia and Australia and Maine in the US, the state of Maine, it's 1.5 meters and 1.8 meters, the social distancing. So we see already certain differences. Now, another common measure is hygiene. And with hygiene, it's the use of hand sanitizer. In certain countries, the employer has to provide employees with the hand sanitizer. And I just want to share with you this story. I was talking to a colleague from the oil and gas industry, and he told me about this story where an employee got burns from the use of hand sanitizer. And there are certain risks with the use of alcohol-based hand sanitizer. The problem is that if you don't let it dry, and if you are close to an ignition source, such as a cigarette, or even if you rub an object and you create a static electricity, then a flame will create a flame. And that's what happened with this person. And he got first and second level burns. So this is one of the things to take into account with all these new ways of work that we need to adjust, that new risk will arise. So just wanted to point out that there is actually a warning from the oil and gas industry to employees in order for them to use it correctly. And also it says that, well, the hand washing has the same effect and it's even preferred. And that leads me to my next point, that is the frequent hand washing. And again, we see some differences. For example, in Colombia, it's very prescriptive and it says every 3 hours they have to wash their hands. Whereas in other countries, it's just practice frequent hand washing and no indication on how often they have to do it. Then cleaning and disinfecting is also very important, and the employers have to do it more often than they used to do it before. And for that, there is guidance in certain countries. For example, in the US and Australia, they have issued certain guidance in order for employers to be able to implement that requirement. Then another common measure is the access control. So the employers have to designate certain entry points so they can check and restrict the access to those persons that have symptoms, that exhibit symptoms, or that are sick. For example, that's the case of Michigan in the US, where they have to have a protocol, but there's no indication on how this protocol has to be. Whereas, for example, in Singapore, they have to have, for example, is a contact tracing, and they have to have to scan safe entry management system. And how does it work? Well, they have to, the workplaces, malls and shops, they have to have it. And well, how does it work is that they use their barcode reader, and scan the people's IDs. Or the people, they can scan a QR code for the site, for the specific site or shop that they're visiting. And in that way, that gives them peace of mind, because in case they were in contact with a person that had COVID-19, they will be alerted. So those are the kind of measures that we see in that side. Then we also have the health checks, and this is also relevant. They have to take the temperature sometimes at the entry point. In some other cases, they have to check the temperature during the day, at least twice a day, and the employer has to be able to prove in case they have an inspection. The other measure that is very common is to promote remote work as much as possible and restrict business travel as much as possible, and also restrict any visits to the site. This is the case of Colombia, where we see that it's very prescriptive, and they say that even the delivery of documents, there has to be kind of a procedure. So the person delivering the documents has to leave them in a place, and then another person will come and pick them up. So there is no direct contact among the persons. Those are some of the common measures. But what about mental health? So in Australia, they issued a national mental health and well-being pandemic response plan. And this is because the employees might find it difficult to transition and to go back to work, to the workplace, because they're afraid of the virus, or maybe they're not very happy with the measures that the employers had to take, and I'm not talking about EHS related measures. So in order to address those problems, this plan has some initiatives that the employer may want to implement. So among those are boosting supervision and support, especially for those workers who continue to work from home, providing training and professional development opportunities, and finally addressing staff shortages to alleviate excessive workloads. There are other measures, of course, I just put these ones. And if you want to know more about all the COVID-19 developments, you can go to this website for Enhesa. We have been covering all of the COVID-19 issues and also creating content about them. For example, we have recorded some mini webcasts focused on a specific regulations, on a specific requirements, and for specific jurisdictions. And all of the content is available for free. So you can just go to this website and check what is available there. We have regular updates. Finally, I just want to give some recommendations, because even if we find certain new requirements, what is important is that the main requirements remain relevant. So even if I didn't mention review risk assessments, Richard has already mentioned, again, you have to assess those new risks that will arise. The use of hand sanitizer, for example, the use of face mask or any personal protective equipment that you might need to give now because of COVID-19, and that was not necessary before. This might arise, it might lead to new risks, so you have to assess them. Then provide employees with information. This is always relevant, and of course with this COVID-19 situation as well, and provide employees with training. And I think it's very important to keep in mind the regulatory nuances in the different jurisdictions whenever you implement the measures. And that's it for me. Thanks for listening, and I will hand it over to Richard. Thanks.
Thank you, Gabriella. That was an excellent start, some fascinating content there. If you could just mute now. I'd like to invite Malcolm now, if you could share your screen and unmute, please, Malcolm.
Yeah, I'm on mute. I just wanted to say firstly to everybody hello, and that I hope that your families are safe and sound wherever you are in the world. Okay. What I want to do is give you an overview of what we've been doing within L'Oréal. Okay. And as from our point of view, a little bit aligning with what was said by Gabriella, you know, for us, it's a worldwide challenge. It's a global challenge. We're 88,000 employees and at least as many temporary workers plus subcontractors throughout the globe in 150 countries. And it's been a challenge, but we had one advantage in some respects, and that was we have quite a lot of operations in China. So when the epidemic started in China, we were supporting China, trying to help them, getting masks to them and so on and so forth. But what it did, it gave us precious information on how to prepare if and when, and it was a big if at that time, because we thought it might have been contained over in China, if it came over to Europe and then expanded maybe even into the United States and the Americas. But it's not an easy world, and if I just take an example of masks and thermal cameras, you know, we looked at 66 different countries where we operate, and there are different standards, different requirements across these. If you take the idea of masks, only 16% are provided by local authorities. Where in public, 54% was mandatory. Public transport, 56%. In the workplace, 44%. It's a nightmare. But we decided within the context of duty of care, we wanted to be consistent and apply the same kind of rules to everybody worldwide. So in some respects, that became an issue for us because we were going into the pandemic. But at the same time, China started to exit. So what did we do in L'Oréal? We created a centralized crisis committee for which occupational health and safety, in this case, myself and my team were at the center of that because this was seen as a health crisis worldwide. We developed global instructions, and they were put together by work groups, including doctors, lawyers when needed, our hygiene specialists, etc. But they were top down. We're a very centralized company when it comes to our directives and our requirements. And we felt that what was needed by our sites, whether it be an admin site, R&I, a warehouse or a factory, and even our sales force, the people that work in our shops, they needed direction. And that's, we decided to give them that direction, for which it is non-negotiable that the sites and the people need to follow. But we do give them the flexibility to adapt it to local requirements. I mean, obviously, as you all know, what we don't want to do is be in conflict with local requirements. However, if the L'Oréal requirement is more strict than the local requirements, then they apply the L'Oréal requirement. Okay. They were in single page format and they were direct to the point, you know, and if needed, and we changed them. You know, one of the things that we learned very quickly is that the evolution of the virus, the knowledge of the virus changed all the time, and therefore we need to change decisions. So if one day we made a decision on a certain subject, and 2 days later we had more information, we were humble enough to change it. You know, it's not a matter of saying, oh no, we've already written it 2 days ago, we can't change it. No, change it, move on. This is a list of the instructions that we had throughout L'Oréal. What you see on the left-hand side of your screen is the general instructions that we use for countries that were going into lockdown. So that would give them the guidance that they needed. It covered everything from basic hygiene, temperature measurements, meetings, travel, truck deliveries, parcel deliveries, retail, service providers, visitors, etc. But that gave everybody guidance and direction of what they needed to do. And what we then did on the other side of the page, you'll see the instructions that have been developed for coming out of lockdown. They allow a certain amount of a phased approach, and the standards are changed as needed depending on the evolution that we're seeing within the world. And our feedback that we got on those that are out there that are occupational safety and health professionals, I think most of you are, that kind of guidance was important, was vital for our sites. Okay. Oh yes, they still had to realize what was going on locally with the local regulations, etc. But at least when it came to duty of care, they had a central guidance that would come in from corporate that for them made sense. When it came to exiting the lockdown and return to workplace, duty of care was central to everything that we wanted to do. We put in place, and I'll show you some examples a little bit later quickly on some other slides, on access control on the entrances. So temperature taking, just to let you know, any facility within L'Oréal that has more than 200 people should have thermal cameras. We've required thermal cameras to be put in place. If you're less than 200 people, you can have thermal cameras if you wish, or if not, then it'll be handheld portable cameras, thermometers. Welcome desk screens so that people at reception were protected, as was mentioned earlier. Sanitizer and masks available, yeah, great. One of the things to go back is you have to remember very often when you're in the confinement period, masks are not available freely. You know, we struggle to find masks. We'd sent all our masks over to China, everyone that we could get hold of. So it became an issue. So it became more and more important to enforce and to make sure that the distances between people met the requirements of the country, which added a further complication because some countries are 1 meter, which is aligned with the World Health Organization requirements. And that's the case here where I am in Paris, France. Other countries do 1.5 meters. Other countries do 2 meters. And that is obviously one of those things that is changed within the L'Oreal system as a function of the requirements of the country. I've mentioned good hygiene practices. Business continuity planning was critical for us because very quickly we realized that we had the capacity, for example, to manufacture gel, hand gel. And we modified our sites as quickly as possible in order to start to be able to manufacture gel to give to the local communities. And I think over a period of about a month, we converted 28 of our 41 facilities, manufacturing facilities worldwide in order to manufacture gel. The ones that we didn't convert were the ones that I think you can all understand why. They just couldn't deal with flammable liquids. So they didn't have the right equipment with respect to ATEX, so it wasn't possible. But in the meantime, because our stores were closing, our outlets were closing, we had to also reorientate, and we started making more cream. Why more cream, hand cream? Because it was required by the hospitals. Because when you're using a lot of gel, your hands dry, so there was more cream to be required, being manufactured. So that took a lot of time. The other thing that became apparent, especially in the lockdown phase, was, you know, people were asking for masks. You know, they were seeing pictures of people in China with masks and so on and so forth, and we didn't have them. So we had to, it created stress, it created tension, it created people that started to have a fear of work, fear of being at work rather than being at home, like with a lot of people. So we dealt with mental health by conversations. It wasn't e-learning, it wasn't other kind of training or whatever. It was just creating conversations with managers so people could express themselves. The other thing that happened in this particular case as well, when people have come back to work, we've only sent 25% to our admin side, 25% of our people have gone back to the office in those countries that have exited lockdown. And what we've used that as well for is for them to talk through teams to other people within the teams to talk about their experience of going to work and getting to work. Most of the people were quite happy about being at work, they felt safe, no problem at all. The issue is public transport and getting to work. So having some people in the situation that had lived it, that were then talking and creating conversations with the rest of the team members through the management was quite an important step. And something that I would highly recommend to you all is to create those conversations of witness statements of what their experience is about going back to work and so on and so forth. These now I'm rapidly going to go through, you'll get these slides afterwards, some photographs of things that we've done and we've put in place in order to reassure our employees, to be able to physically demonstrate as well our duty of care with respect to our auditors. We're having auditors coming in to check that we're doing what we said we were going to do in all our sites. And this you can see with the thermal camera, the arrival at reception, etc., the main entrances within one of our buildings. Here, a bit closer view of the thermal camera, which, to be honest with you, you know, there was a lot of debate about this, and the systems that we have in place were very open, so the person can see their image as they arrive, and there is no storing of data at all. So from that point of view, we avoided any problems with GDPR. See the lifts, the kind of thing that we would have, the lifts, limiting the number of people to actually physically go into a lift, using the idea of 4 square meters. If the distance between you is 1 square meter, like it is in France, 4 square meters per person. Here you see a situation in the offices, anything on the open space areas whereby things like the individual telephone booths or individual working booths have been closed, and the development of tools, do not touch tools as we call them, to be able to open doors, push buttons and so on and so forth. Picture of a canteen where you can see the same kind of thing of trying to keep people away from each other, providing gel and so on and so forth. This is the cafeteria area. So it's not the canteen as such. Most of our sites have a separate area whereby you can just go have coffee anytime you want during the day. And of course, we put the screens in and so on and so forth. One thing that I would like to point out to you is you've seen here, if you look at the screens behind where the lady that's serving the coffee is, we've created something because we think it's going to be permanent. We think in the new way of working, hygiene is going to be much more important in the future. It's going to continue to be at the high level it is at the moment. Therefore, we haven't done things that have been a bit of a do-it-yourself kind of approach. We wanted it to look really, really professional, and we wanted it to be built to last over time. But of course, you've got to remember, in our situation, back to the workplace, but some people are still staying at home. So it's very important not to forget them. What Gabriella said about mental health, etc. Keeping in touch, create little moments for the teams. We've done this within L'Oreal, and we put it in a program. We like developing programs, and we've called it Safe Together. So the idea is that we look after each other, we talk to each other, we keep in touch. The other thing that's important is the aspect of the local community. Duty of care to us doesn't stop at the gates of the factory. It's also outside. It's also making sure our families are safe, making sure that the local communities are safe, and we provide them the kind of things that are needed. A little bit of an extension of our program that some of you may have heard of, called Safe at Work, Safe at Home, where we try to export our health and safety culture externally. Same thing here, we're part of the community. We need the community need us, and this is the kind of things that we just seem like the right thing to do, but part of our external duty of care. And when it comes to hand sanitizer, we're going to be producing and making sure that we produce it just as long as needed. Take home. So for me, duty of care is global, and it's beyond legal. There's also the moral obligations of duty of care, and that comes into the communities, people at home. It doesn't stop at the family gates. When it comes to developing your expectations and your requirements, remember, we're talking about people's lives, protecting them, making sure that the hygiene rules are followed, because this coronavirus, you can have 250 million viruses on the end of a pin. We can't see it. So you need to be very direct with your expectations, but you need to allow adaptation to local requirements and local culture. Okay, it's very, very important. And be humble. If you write something today and you expect something today and you have better information tomorrow, in a crisis situation like we're all in, change. Be humble. Say, okay, you've got more information, things have changed, but be humble. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Malcolm. That was really great presentation, and thanks for sharing those invaluable experiences with us. Next up, we have David Green from the Law Society. So, David, if you could unmute yourself and take it away, please.
I think I'm unmuted. Thank you very much, Richard. I'm very grateful to IOSH to give me a platform to deal with some broader issues actually about law and about the Covid-19 pandemic. I see that you're very short of time, so I'm going to keep it short. So I'm Vice President of the Law Society of England and Wales, and we represent about 190,000 solicitors, lawyers throughout England and Wales. And getting back to the workplace, I don't talk about getting back to work, because we're all working, getting back to the workplace is now core to our activities. But I wanted very briefly to address some of the headline concerns we're seeing across the world in a broader sense, challenges to the rule of law, human rights, and the spike in domestic abuse, before moving on to issues most pertinent to a return to work, so workers' rights, immigration, and cross-border travel. Let me just start with human rights and the rule of law. There's no doubt that the legislation that has been brought in across the world confronts the rule of law and, for instance, access to justice, personal freedoms. All of those are very much challenged. The International Bar Association recently was talking about that governments are leveraging the pandemic to repeal or amend human rights laws that disproportionately affect women and minorities. We've seen arrests of 2 lawyers in Hong Kong more than 6 months after they were alleged to have committed crimes. Is in a way looks like that sort of behaviour. In Hungary, the Orban administration passed legislation allowing it to rule by decree without a time limit. And we have expressed our concerns as the European Union has. We're hoping that things will change actually in Hungary. In Poland, we've seen the government take the lessened likelihood of mass protests as an opportunity to reintroduce contentious legislation on abortion. In Jordan, some governments are resorting to emergency powers for those critiques of the response to the pandemic, prison threats and fines. In April, Iraq suspended Reuters' license for over 3 months over reporting cases to be occurring at a higher rate than that communicated by the government. So again, critiquing the government. Now, that is all sobering news. And it's not only us at the Law Society, but I think you will find the legal profession and others, of course, throughout the world have concerns as to whether this legislation is going to continue, and the importance of having sunset clauses within it. Domestic abuse victims are particularly vulnerable during lockdown. Again, the world over, and we've been speaking out about that over the past few months. At the end of April, the United Nations Population Fund predicted at least 15 million more cases of domestic violence globally in 2020 as a result of these restrictions. Something that legal systems negotiating lockdown and social distancing find it a struggle to deal with. And of course, this is exacerbated in the UK and indeed around the world by the lack of physical access to courts and by the inability of victims to get time away from abusers. And in the UK, for instance, we've been engaging with Parliament on the domestic abuse bill, which is currently going through the House of Commons. We know that many jurisdictions, bars and law societies have been taking up these issues about the increase in domestic abuse. A little more relevant to the subject we're discussing today has been workers' rights. We've seen landmark rulings against Amazon in France on lack of hygiene in warehouses. The state of California has legislated in relation to the gig economy and workers' rights, and indeed we're seeing that within England and Wales as well, with decisions about gig economy workers' rights. Close to home, close to the UK, the Independent Workers Union is taking legal action against the Chancellor of the Exchequer, claiming that government income support for self-employed people discriminates against minority groups that make up a significant proportion of the gig workforce. And I think we're going to see a lot of that type of challenge to governments around the world about that form of discrimination that comes out of the legislation that's put into effect very quickly. And also there's been a discussion of the hypothetical right to disconnect i.e. for workers to disconnect from their work. And of course that gets challenges where the boundaries between home and work blur. So, you know, we have expressed concerns. I know the IBA has expressed concerns about the right to disconnect and ensure that there's a work-life balance. International travel and immigration. So another legal area of interest to many corporations and firms is international travel and immigration. Businesses want to employ international talent, and this often requires people to relocate. Meanwhile, normal business operation for many service providers requires cross-border travel. So throughout February and March, many countries closed their borders without warning as a result of the pandemic, and in some cases leaving expats stranded. Some countries have extended temporary visas, New Zealand, Thailand, many EU members, and Australia has changed student visas. In the UK, temporary visa extension has not been automatic, but by request. There are also questions that need answering on the visa status of those who are currently on furlough and will be made redundant when the furlough ends. So some real questions for those and uncertainty. Finally, procurement we've seen across the world relaxation of procurement laws. This is to ensure that public buyers can purchase sufficient quantities of medical supplies, PPE and otherwise to deal with the pandemic. However, this can increase corruption risks such as price gouging. The non-governmental organisation Transparency International has warned that in some instances, governments are being forced to pay 25 times the original price. So all of these broad issues we have concern with. We want to ensure that when we get back to the workplace, when we get back to a degree of normality, we can see the re-establishment of principles of the rule of law, access to justice, all of these issues. Well, I'm hopeful that we will see that, and certainly we and colleagues around the world in the legal profession are seeking to ensure that happens.
David, many thanks for that fascinating presentation and helpful insights, and for cutting back a bit of the lost time. I appreciate that. Now hand over to Mary Lawrence. Mary, if you could share your screen and unmute, please.
Yes, thank you very much. Great. Well, having heard from several of our speakers about the international comparisons on COVID-19, I'm going to finish this session by focusing in specifically on the UK and how to apply the law when returning for or planning for a return safely from lockdown to workplaces. So firstly, when I talk about law in relation to managing the COVID health risk in a workplace, what am I talking about? So in the UK, applicable law largely falls into two camps of legislation. Firstly, we have the new legislation, which has been created specifically in response to coronavirus. And I'm going to focus on the restrictions regulations as they apply in England here, but helpfully in the UK, we also have separate regulations for Wales, for Northern Ireland, for Scotland. And secondly, we have this group of pre-existing health and safety legislation. And that's the law that I would anticipate that this audience should be pretty familiar with in your own countries. In the UK, that is fundamentally the Health and Safety at Work Act, but also the Management of Health and Safety at Work regulations and the other supporting regulations that we use day to day to manage health and safety risk in a workplace setting. Now, in the UK, our coronavirus specific legislation was created at the end of March. It was then amended in May, and it's going to be amended each time there's an easing of restrictions. And it is really important that if you go to look at the law in your specific countries, that you know that the law that you're looking at is in force on the day. Because at the moment, laws are changing a lot, frequently. They don't always get media attention. It's very easy to be looking at the wrong thing. So that is where the lawyers come in. So having identified the applicable coronavirus legislation on the day, how should you be advising your businesses about their health and safety legal duties in COVID-19? Well, in England, Regulation 4 and Schedule 2 of the restrictions set out details of those businesses who simply cannot trade at all at the moment in the UK. So that includes businesses such as cinemas, beauty parlours, gyms, and for consumption on premises, restaurants and pubs. So an update in law is going to be needed in the UK for those businesses to reopen fully. We then have a category of businesses in our Regulation 5 that are restricted in the way in which they operate. So these businesses are ones who offer goods for sale or for hire. The regulations basically set out that they mustn't trade in person, but they've still been able to trade throughout lockdown online or by telephone, etc. Also in this category, we've got restrictions on hotels and when they can provide accommodation to people, to whom. And so far, we've seen a little bit of change to those regulations, to those businesses in England. So we had a lot of noise about garden centres reopening a couple of weeks ago, for instance. And we're expecting changes in June for a lot of our other shops. But importantly, for all other businesses that don't fall into those two categories, there is no fundamental ban in the UK or restriction on operation. So when you think about restrictions, you're really looking at what are people generally allowed to do under coronavirus laws. And this is what's really created lockdown for a lot of businesses. So to look at that, in England, we look at Regulation 6, and there is similar for all our other three nations, about what we are allowed to do as any person in the UK in terms of travel and movement. Basically, when are we allowed to leave home? And the law here says that you can leave home if you have a reasonable excuse. It goes on to list some examples of reasonable excuses. In terms of work, that includes that you're allowed to leave the house for work, but still only if it's not possible to work at home. In terms of leaving home to, for instance, be a customer in a business premises, that will change, no doubt, as lockdown restrictions ease, but there are specific descriptions given there. Having identified what your business can and can't do under these specific coronavirus legislation then, what I would suggest you then need to do is refocus on the health and safety law that you're probably quite familiar with and its principles. So again, in the UK, your fundamental duty under the Health and Safety at Work Act to ensure the health and safety of both employees and others impacted by your business so far as reasonably practicable under Section 2 and 3 remains as good as it ever has done in terms of fundamental principles. The big question is, what do we mean by reasonably practicable in this environment? Well, firstly, you need to look at the specific restrictions by coronavirus legislation that we've just been through. But thereafter, you need to be thinking about, at that point, looking at your government guidance and industry guidance out there, and thinking really carefully about how you can minimise the risk of an infectious person coming into your workplace. Secondly, reducing the risk of spread, and thirdly, eliminating any sign of the virus through your hygiene measures. More specifically, in terms of application of health and safety law, all of that specific law still exists. Critically, in the UK, businesses are being told, as we heard from Enhesa, as is the case in other countries as well, that businesses need to create a COVID-19 specific risk assessment, and that they need to provide the results of that risk assessment to employees. Those of us who operate in the UK know that risk assessment is a requirement in law anyway for all health and safety risks in a business setting. So what's really important here is that in the UK, you're going to be expected to have something very specific for COVID-19 risks before you're returning back in, or a very short time after you return back into your workplace. A slide on the legal status of guidance and whether an organisation does or doesn't have to follow COVID-19 guidance, government issued or otherwise. So in the UK, none of the guidance that we have been discussing so far or that we've been seeing currently has a legal status on its own. However, remember in law that you have to do everything that is reasonably practicable to reduce risk and to ensure safety. And I suggest that for most of businesses, it's government guidance that's going to provide you that benchmark on what good looks like. And indeed, the Health and Safety Executive, as our main health and safety regulator, directs you straight to government guidance in terms of how you comply. So in the UK, your starting point will be to look at legislation, then to look at what we call the COVID-19 secure government guidance, then industry guidance, ideally the industry guidance that's being endorsed by government, and then all the other guidance out there, be it the World Health Organization or other specific pieces that we're seeing out there, use that to fill in your gaps. Now, if you're in a business where you don't have a specific guidance note applicable to your business, and there are 8 currently on the main government page, read the ones that are there and think about the principles and how they could apply to your business. If you really can't follow guidance, and that's the case where it's not possible or there is some other reason why practically you just simply can't do, you're going to need to think really carefully about your approach moving away from it and how you set that out in your documentation to really justify your rationale. There are 3 actions which are set out in UK guidance that I suspect many of you are going to be asked to support on as lockdown eases. So firstly, the creation of this COVID-19 specific risk assessment. We don't have time in this session to discuss in any detail, but you've heard some really useful ideas from the various speakers. And really just touch on the idea that take the government guidance to give you some of your headings and to think about how you produce this assessment, as well as looking at control measures you can put in place. Secondly, there's this idea of sharing results with employees. Now, in terms of this requirement, it's really important to note that you do not have to share your whole risk assessment with employees. As you will know, these tend to be really detailed documents, not necessarily very user-friendly. So what you need to do is think about how you are going to share the core information and in what form, how to make the information digestible. Really, you want to communicate something to your employees that says, this is how we are keeping you safe. And thirdly, the publishing of results. Now, in the UK, there is guidance that says, if possible, you should consider publishing on your website, and we would expect all businesses with over 50 employees to do so. Again, like employees information, this is about talking about your results rather than publishing your actual risk assessment. And I suggest you want to get your language right. It needs to be reassuring. It needs to have enough detail to build confidence that you've done your risk assessment, set out some detail about what action you have actually taken. And I think this is very much a document that you're going to want your comms teams to look at so that you're using the familiar language. And finally then, touching on the question we're getting from businesses, and we know that you are getting from employees as well. If someone comes back to work and they contract COVID-19, could the business, or indeed individual managers or directors, be held accountable in law? So for those of you practicing in the UK, you will know that here we have 2 main forms of legal liability which would impact on health and safety here. Firstly, potential criminal liability. So a company or its directors can be criminally prosecuted if they fail to ensure the safety of employees or others. Usually that comes by way of a criminal prosecution brought by the Health and Safety Executive. And then the second form of liability is civil liability. So an employee or their family could sue for damages, i.e. money, if they can demonstrate a breach of law, which they can show caused an injury or a disease. Now, in COVID-19, it is possible that the HSE, as our main regulator, could prosecute a company for failing to properly address COVID-19 risk in the workplace. However, I think that the HSE are going to reserve those powers for the very most serious breaches. So companies who do nothing to put measures in place or to enforce or to take action when things go wrong. I think it will be accepted that in these times things can go wrong, and the HSE is certainly talking at the moment only about their use of enforcement notice powers, and they're staying silent on their powers about criminal prosecution. In terms of civil liability, again, in theory, it is possible for an action to be brought by, for instance, an employee who contracts COVID. However, this is likely to be really difficult for an employee to prove, because an employee in that circumstance will have to demonstrate not only that there was some kind of failure by the company to put adequate measures in place, but also they're going to have to demonstrate that they contracted the disease from work rather than from anywhere else they had been. And this is going to be really difficult. So use your knowledge on liability wisely. You may need to remind your business that these requirements set out in your risk assessments do have teeth, but you may also need to reassure your managers and your people that they're not going to get sued if they sensibly adopt and seek to enforce measures in line with government guidance. So on that note, Richard, I'll hand back to you.
Mary, many thanks. That was great, really informative. And indeed, thanks to all our speakers for some wonderful insights into employers' obligations, both legal and ethical. I was going to, we've run over time, I'm afraid, but I think it was important to hear what our speakers had to say. So I was going to ask each a question. Perhaps we could just have a one-sentence answer from the three. Malcolm Staves, unfortunately, has had to leave. He has a prior appointment. So from Gabriella, Malcolm and David, if you could just give me a one-sentence answer. What, from your perspective, what do you think are the most important obligations for employers in this pandemic, and whether there are any less obvious ones that you'd also like to highlight? So Gabriella, could I invite you to say first?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Richard. So I would say that the most important, I would say, is reviewing and updating the risk assessment, because that will give you the path in order to know what measures you have to put in place. I would say that would be one of the most important, and the less obvious, I would say, with cleaning and disinfecting, identifying those points that you have to do it, because sometimes the requirement is like you have to do it on a regular basis. Those points that are the common points to do it more often, and I think that's that will be difficult to understand. I know, for example, in Spain they have to do it to clean the toilets, I think every 6 times a day. In other places, there's no indication. So what is the, yeah, I think that would be, I also see requirements like block the coffee machine. So yeah, I think there are things that will be less obvious, but yeah, we have to keep in mind.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you very much, Gabriella. David, have you got a quick?
I think just in short is take advice. That these are complex issues, and I think that take advice from IOSH or lawyers or whatever it is, health and safety experts. I think it's take advice. I just wanted to add one little point, is that the return to the workplace, and I say it's return to the workplace, is quite important for companies and for firms, for instance, is because the physical workspace often envelops the culture of the workplace and the firm and the company. And I think that's an underestimated concept about getting people back to getting the workplace open again in order to ensure that you maintain that culture.
That's great. Thank you, David. Mary, have you just got one final thought for us?
Really quick points. I would say really important, this communication with employees piece. If you expect your people to go in before you've actually told them how you're going to keep them safe, you're simply not going to get your people back in. So that engagement and communication piece, I think, really important. And one thing that was mentioned earlier, but it's not getting mentioned enough, is how are you actually going to enforce your procedures, particularly in terms of your corporate culture. So I think that's really important to think about.
That's great. That's great, Mary. Thank you very much. Really good points. I'd like to thank all our speakers for their excellent and informative presentations and comments. Before we end the webinar, I'd just like to summarize and leave you with some key points. We've heard today that though there are different legal requirements across the different jurisdictions, the basic obligations and duties of care approaches are very similar, with multinational organizations tending to apply the same systems globally. Many responsible employers combine mandatory legal compliance requirements with additional voluntary social commitments so that they can achieve safety, success, and sustainability. So to summarize, here are some key considerations for organizations planning to reopen. First one, to comply with rules and assess them and manage COVID and OSH risks and ensure safe work resumption using a systematic approach, the hierarchy of control and excellent communications, as Mary's just pointed out. Second, to make sure you protect workers, vulnerable groups, and those at higher risk of serious illness, such as those with underlying health problems. Thirdly, show strong leadership, worker engagement, and the use of good occupational safety and health advice, as David pointed out, and to provide appropriate training, physical distancing, hygiene, ventilation, and PPE, together with ongoing monitoring of mental health support. Importantly, keep up to date in this fast-moving situation. Fourth, provide ongoing physical and mental health support, recognizing that some effects may be long-lasting, and consider the needs of all workers, including those on the front line, those with health conditions, those working from home, and those still furloughed. And finally, extend risk management into supply chains wherever feasible, ensuring that those who are self-employed or work in the informal economy are also supported to stay safe and healthy. Well, I hope you've all enjoyed this webinar. And a recording of it will be made available on the IOSH website at iosh.com/coronavirus, together with regularly updated information. We'd also be grateful if you could complete the feedback survey, please, which will help us to continually improve our webinars. So a huge thanks again to our brilliant speakers, and of course all of you for joining us. I'd like to end the session by saying that we'll send you all a link to the recording via email, so look into your inboxes soon. And as I mentioned earlier, remember that these webinars take place every Thursday, so keep an eye on our COVID-19 webinar page and other IOSH channels. Our next webinar is COVID-19, Managing Mental Wellbeing when Returning to Work, and that'll be on the 4th of June. So thanks again. Please take care and stay healthy, everyone. Bye-bye.